Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Mara Herman, Health Policy Specialist here at the Ecology Center, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Here is our webinar agenda. Currently, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please use the chat box to share it. After today's presentation, we'll have time for questions. Also, please note, today's webinar is being recorded and materials from today's presentation will be made available tomorrow. After today's presentation, you should be able to identify ways in which pesticide use negatively affects health outcomes and places where pesticides show up in the food system. We're really lucky to be joined by Kendra Klein this evening. Kendra is the Senior Staff Scientist at Friends of the Earth, where she leads work on food and farming solutions. She is a writer, researcher, and advocate with over 15 years of experience in environmental sustainability, food, agriculture, and environmental health. Prior to joining Friends of the Earth, she coordinated farm-to-institution work at the California Healthy Food and Healthcare Campaign and worked at Breast Cancer Action on chemical policy reform and corporate accountability related to pink ribbon fundraising. Kendra has apprenticed on organic farms in California and Hawaii. She is a 2011 Switzer Environmental Fellow and has written for The Nation, Gastronomica, Civil Eats, Food Tank, and Switzer Environmental Fellow, and has written for, and EcoWatch and peer-reviewed journals. She holds a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies from Miami University of Ohio and a PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley. So again, we're so lucky to be joined by her tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kendra for her presentation.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here so you all can see this presentation. And okay, so I'm joining you from my home in San Francisco, and I put on real clothes for this event, and it's making me feel great. It's really nice to have an opportunity to connect with folks and a reason to dress up more or less during these times. So many thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to talk to you today about research and also about advocacy through the lens of the work that I do for Friends of the Earth, all about pesticides and about organic as a solution. So you may have seen headlines like this in recent years about plummeting insect numbers associated with pesticide use, about human exposure. Glyphosate has been in the news as a result of high-profile court cases. It's the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, and recently was determined to be a probable human carcinogen. So people generally know about pesticides, but not necessarily where the risks are and what their risk is. For the general population, their primary route of exposure is through what they eat, and that is true for most of us. This is data from the USDA, which tests a whole set of foods for pesticide residues. And what I pulled out here is residue data just for apples. And you can see 47 different residues were found, and these are associated with a whole set of different health harms as well as honeybee toxicity. So there's a growing body of data that links pesticide exposure to carcinogenicity, hormone disruption, neurotoxicity, and developmental and reproductive toxicity. So we've got reason to be concerned. This is pulled from what's on myfood.org, which is a fantastic site where Pesticide Action Network translates that USDA data into a format where you can search by food item or by pesticide and search the data yourself. We know that exposure is ubiquitous. So this is a small study that was done by another nonprofit, Environmental Working Group. They tested the cord blood of 10 infants and found, on average, 200 industrial compounds and 21 out of 28 pesticides. that they tested for. We know from CDC data that if I tested all of you who are listening, I would most likely find pesticides in all of you. And on average, the typical American has 34 out of the pesticides that we're testing for. We're not even testing for the whole span. We know that cumulative exposures add up. So one study looked at children's exposure to a particular type of pesticide called organophosphates. And these are associated with neurological impairment. So things like increased risk of ADHD, autism, learning disabilities. And the study found that approximately 40% of US children may be exposed at levels greater than benchmarks for neurological impacts. Some good news is that in the 10-year span since then, we have been reducing use of organophosphates. And yet, what this points to is that we're all exposed to what you could consider a toxic soup of pesticides that result in harms that we really, at this point, don't even know. I mean, like most toxic exposures, we've done very little research on synergistic impacts, compounding impacts. And our regulatory process approaches pesticides one by one. So the legal levels of food residues are set as if we're exposed to only one pesticide at a time, which is not true. We know that pregnant women, infants, children, and adolescents are more vulnerable to exposure because these are times when our bodies are rapidly growing, our systems are developing, and so even small exposures can have serious and lifelong impacts. And we know that the most vulnerable among us are farm workers, their families, and rural communities. And I pulled out just one study here out of UC Davis showing that mothers who live within a mile of fields where toxic pesticides are applied had a 60% higher chance of having kids with autism. And that link was strongest with an insecticide called CHLORPYRIFOS. And I'll tell you a bit more about CHLORPYRIFOS later. As a snapshot of the farm worker community in Michigan, there's approximately 50,000 migrant and seasonal farm workers. Michigan grows a whole set of crops that require farm labor. So while corn and soy don't require as much farm worker labor, specialty crops like cherries, grapes, cucumbers require people to be in the field and result in high levels of exposure. And we know that farm workers are at higher risk for a whole range of health problems, increased risk of cancer, respiratory illness, and of course, direct poisonings. So the best estimates we have are that 10 to 20,000 acute poisonings of farm workers happen every year in the US. That is likely an underestimate, given that many farm workers are not likely to report or to go to the hospital because they're undocumented and may have language barriers. This is images from a really compelling study from Mexico. I've included a link there. I think that you'll get the slides and can watch that yourself. It's an 8-minute video, and I always show it to classes when I'm teaching because it's so powerful. And what this study did was take two populations in Mexico that were the same culturally, racially, but lived in two different locations. One down in the valley where high amounts of pesticides were being used, and one up in the foothills that had much lower pesticide exposure. And what you're seeing is in the valley that those children had very serious developmental delays in their ability to draw a human figure, which is one of the markers that we can use to gauge neurodevelopment in children. In California, we've got our own Yaqui Valley of sorts. We are known as the salad bowl of the nation or even of the world. Like Michigan, we grow many different specialty crops that require a lot of farm worker labor. And we we're lucky to have an ongoing study of rural populations in the Salinas Valley out of UC Berkeley, known as the Chamaco study. And this is really some of the longest term data that we've got on pesticide exposure and health outcomes. In 2000, 600 pregnant women were enrolled, and the researchers have been tracking their children since then. So these kids are now 19, 20, 21, and there's a wealth, there's so many studies that have come out of this data, but some of the top points that I want to pick out here for you is looking at mom's exposure to organophosphates during pregnancy. And higher levels of exposure are associated with a range of negative health outcomes. So shorter pregnancies, poor neonatal reflexes, lower IQ, and increased risk of attention problems in children. So this is, again, I mentioned organophosphates in a previous slide, and one of the most notorious being CHLORPYRIFOS. We know that pollinators are also near and dear to many people's hearts. Friends of the Earth, along with working on human health, does a lot of work on pollinators. And what we find is that what is harmful to us is harmful to pollinators. And really, the steep declines in monarch and other butterfly and honeybee populations, these are like the canaries in the cornfields. In the same way that canaries in a mine warn us that we're on a deadly track, the massive drops in insect populations warn us similarly that agriculture is on a very toxic track. 40% of all pollinating species are on the brink of extinction. Last year, a meta-analysis came out about global insect populations and showed that 40% of all insect populations may face extinction in coming decades if we don't change the way we farm, if we don't restore insect habitat, and of course, climate change is another massive driver. This is a study that I co-authored last fall, showing that US agriculture is now 48 times more toxic to insect life than it was 2 decades ago. What changed? We began using a new class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics. These are persistent in the environment. So if you think back to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, really Carson sounded the alarm bell on pesticide use and its harms to the environment and to humans decades ago. One of the problems she was raising was the persistence of pesticides. So neonics are not as persistent as DDT, but they are more persistent than any other insecticides that we have used in recent decades. And they can be 100 times more toxic to insects than DDT. And so a really serious problem that we have been using this class of pesticides in the US have completely failed to take into account the science and regulate them. In the European Union, they have banned all outdoor use of neonicotinoids because of their harm to pollinators. Often the case with toxics that we look to the European Union for leadership. So that's something that I've been working on quite a bit recently. So we've run through human health problems for pollinators in the environment, and then we've got farmers. Are they winning from use of pesticides? And what the data show is that farmers really are on a pesticide treadmill. They're sort of trapped in this system. And that's because nature evolves. Nature evolves resistance to our ubiquitous use of pesticides. So data show that hundreds of weeds and insect species across the globe have developed resistance to pesticides. I find this survey very interesting of Iowa farmers. 90% reported that they feel like pest management is a never-ending technology treadmill. And data show that despite increasing use of pesticides, farmers are losing more of their crops to pests today than they did in the 1940s. So really, this is a failed approach to agriculture, this pesticide-intensive industrial model. Why then do we continue down this path? We are using increasing amounts of pesticides. We're finding higher levels of pesticide residues on our food. We can look to the companies that benefit from continuing on this path. And at this point, due to mergers, there really are just 4 massive agrochemical companies that dominate both the pesticide market and the seed market. Once they started developing genetically engineered seeds, they rapidly bought up seed companies, both in the US and globally. So Bayer and Monsanto merged in 2018, Dow and DuPont have merged, China and Syngenta have merged, and then there's BASF. And these companies spend enormous sums on lobbying. They ghostwrite legislation. They influence research and peer review processes. An organization that does excellent work on lifting, drawing back that veil on the deceptive work that pesticide companies do to keep their products on market is US Right to Know. I pulled this chart out of an op-ed in the New York Times about chlorpyrifos, just showing Dow's increasing lobbying expenditures over time. So Dow donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural party. That's the wrong word. Pardon my brain. And one of the first actions of the Trump EPA was to reverse a federal ban on chlorpyrifos. I pulled out another more recent editorial, really powerful writing. Why has this pesticide not been banned? The EPA itself has determined that there's no safe level of exposure. Children are exposed at levels that far exceed benchmarks for health harm just in the food that they eat. This is one of the pesticides most responsible for farm worker poisonings, and it's also one of the most toxic pesticides for bees and other insects. And yet, the US has continued to keep it on the market. Chlorpyrifos also has been banned in the European Union, which was a huge win recently. A bit later, I'll tell you a little bit more about policy wins on chlorpyrifos. I've listed here some other ways that we're seeing a deregulatory trend under this administration in relation to pesticides. The reversal of the ban on neonics in wildlife refuges, attacking worker protection standards for farm workers, like on many fronts, undermining the role of science. Something that happened just a month ago is the EPA said that Syngenta no longer needs to monitor atrazine pollution in waterways. If you've heard of the work of Tyrone Hayes, this is an herbicide that is associated with hormone disruption, and it can actually change male frogs to female frogs with viable eggs. That is such a powerful endocrine disruptor. Atrazine also has been banned in the European Union. And then also very recently, the government is greenlighting the use of new genetically engineered crops that are not only resistant to glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, which is about 98.1% of all genetically engineered crops grown in the US are tolerant to glyphosate. We've seen glyphosate use rise 600% since we began using those crops. And now weeds develop resistance, right? Nature responds. And so glyphosate is no longer effective enough, and companies are responding with a larger pesticide arsenal. So now they've developed a corn crop that is resistant to stacked glyphosate 2,4-D dicamba glufosinate. And so farmers could plant that corn and then spray these pesticides throughout the season. So we're seeing an escalation of this toxic approach to growing that food. So some good news for you after a lot of heavy news. Good news is that we can reduce exposure. This is a study that I co-authored that came out last year. we did an organic diet intervention with these 4 families across the US. There have been, this I believe was the 6th organic diet intervention, so there's a growing set of literature here. We put them for 6 days on a completely organic diet, tested their urine across these 12 days on a typical diet with no organic food, and then on 6 days with a completely organic diet. We took out these 2 days in our analysis as washout days, and we tested for these 14 different analytes. And what you're seeing in that colored bar on the left are the classes of pesticides that we tested for: organophosphates, erythroids, neonicotinoids, and 2,4-D. And just to say, the term pesticide encompasses both insecticides and herbicides. So you can see there on the right what those are. So malathion, a known carcinogen, chlorpyrifos. Again, that whole class is associated with neurotoxicity, with hormone disruption. Neonicotinoids, I pointed out. This is some of the first biomonitoring data on neonics. And here is what we found. Every single analyte that we tested dropped. Some of them quite dramatically. MDA that you're seeing there is malathion, that dropped 95%. TCPY is chlorpyrifos, that dropped 61%. But that's just 6 days on an organic diet. This, I pulled out the top 4 pesticide decreases per family. And all of that is in a 2-minute video. I tried my best to figure out how to share that video on the presentation today, but I haven't mastered videos in Zoom yet. So you'll get the slides and you'll get that link. We would love if you shared that widely. This is, knowing that people aren't always swayed by only the facts. And so we are telling the story of this science in a way that also reaches people's hearts and tells the story of these 4 families. So these are the other organic diet intervention studies and comparison studies, and all of them have shown that switching to an organic diet rapidly and dramatically reduces exposure to pesticides. And why is that? So this is a busy slide, but what it is showing you on the bottom is that non-organic or conventional farmers are allowed to use over 900 different synthetic active pesticide ingredients. Those active ingredients translate into approximately 17,000 different pesticide products. So Lasso, Roundup, those would be names that you know as a consumer. Organic farmers, on the other hand, are only allowed to use 25 synthetic active pesticide products. These have been vetted. They are least toxic ingredients. I've copied the names of some of them there on the sides so that you can see. And organic farmers are not allowed to use those pesticides unless they've taken other means to try to control their pest problems, which is not a stipulation that is used in conventional agriculture. So you can see why organic farming might dramatically reduce our exposure. There's also been some recent research on positive health outcomes from organic diets. So reduced risk of cancer, improved fertility outcomes, and reduced risk of diabetes for people who report frequently eating organic food. So the stakes are really high for people understanding the benefits of organic, and yet there's a lot of confusion in the media. These are some choice headlines that I've pulled out from the past couple years. Organic, organic, the organic food movement is insufferably classist waste of money. This is the messaging. When I go to talk to college classes and I say, what do you think of when I say organic? Typically the top things that they say are organic is elitist, it's not worth it, it's greenwashing. So this is the result both of a real problem, a a true problem, that organic costs more than conventional food. And so there is a problem with who can access organic food. The other thing happening here is that those same companies that are spending millions on lobbying regulatory processes are also spending tens of millions on what you might say is spinning food. So deceptive media tactics. All of this is documented in a report called Spinning Food. And stay tuned, we've got a Spinning Food 2.0 that hopefully will be coming out in a few months. So much documentation of this was uncovered in the recent court cases around Roundup, around glyphosate. The internal documents of Monsanto have been brought to light. Again, US Right to Know is an organization that has done an excellent job of cataloging those documents and sharing them with the public. So here we've got all of this confusion, and yet we've got all of this science showing organic reduces exposure, showing health benefits, and also showing that the levels of chemicals, including pesticides, that we are exposed to are a real concern for our health. And this is Linda Birnbaum, a former director of NIEHS, who's pointing to recent research on endocrine disruption that is showing that the old idea that the dose makes the poison does not hold true in all cases, and that in some cases for endocrine disruptors, smaller exposures may have a more serious health impact. And I'm guessing you may have talked about this already on other webinars, but if you think about the really infinitesimally small amounts of hormones traveling in our bodies, sending messages to all of our systems, and the fact that different pesticides, different synthetic chemicals can mimic or block or scramble those hormone messages, we begin to understand why small exposures matter. This is a good article on why the legal food residue tolerances of pesticides are not really as protective as they need to be of our health. Why we can't rely on, just seeing that the pesticides we're using and that we're finding on food are meeting safety levels. Again, because we're exposed to a cocktail of these chemicals, because extremely low levels of exposure matter, and because some of us are more vulnerable. For example, babies in utero, adolescents, exposures that may be safe for an adult may not be safe for those populations. So this is, I just want to expand this conversation about the benefits of organic beyond pesticide exposure a bit. And I pulled out 4 issues that, based on the data we've got, organic gets a gold star on. That first, of course, is pesticides. The second is the use of synthetic fertilizers, which are prohibited in organic production, and which are in conventional production leading to dead zones across the world. So this is an image of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Antibiotic use also is prohibited in organic agriculture. In non-organic dairy and livestock production, antibiotics are often used routinely. And this is a source of serious antibiotic-resistant bacteria and undermining the efficacy of antibiotics. And pollinator health. Research shows that organic farms support up to 50% more pollinating species, provide habitat for pollinators and other insects, and of course, less likely to be poisoning many pesticides. Here's a set of issues that I'm giving organic a silver star on. So it's offering benefits, but it's not the whole solution. Farm worker exposure to pesticides, organic, there's a huge win there. At the same time, organic production, the organic seal, does not come with greater protection of farm worker rights in terms of healthcare or salary or anything like that. Organic has been shown to, those two representing climate change and soil health, to build healthier soils, to help sequester carbon in the soil, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and energy associated with agricultural production. And then finally, there are improved animal welfare standards in organic as compared to conventional. And then finally, I'm giving a bronze star in relation to local businesses, or I should say small businesses, not really a star in relation to local, because organic can be as global a production system as conventional. But there are many farmers who have turned to organic and saved their family farms in the process. There's also data that show that counties with high levels of organic farms and businesses reduce overall poverty levels in that county on par with anti-poverty programs. So some good news for economies. So all of this is summarized in a website that we launched last year with our study called organicforall.org. And the goal here really is a form of narrative judo, because that tarnish on organic, that it's elitist, really impedes people's ability to perceive that they have a stake in fighting for the expansion of organic agriculture, for the increased access of all people to organic food. So offering that perspective on why organic matters for our health, for farm workers and farmers, for pollinators and the environment. And really in the hope that people understand that there's both policy and market wins that we need many people to be fighting for on the organic front. This is an op-ed from Rudy Arredondo, who is the president of the National Latino Farmer and Rancher Association, writing from a farm worker perspective about why organic matters. Again, trying to flip that narrative from organic is elitist to organic is a social justice imperative. Reducing farm worker exposure to toxic pesticides is an imperative. And as one of the mothers in our study said so eloquently, everyone has the right to clean organic food. That is a human right. None of us should walk into a store and have to make the choice and have to have the economic power to shop our way out of toxic exposures. This should be the norm for everybody, the safest possible food. So you might think, and this is what many students ask me, that's all well and good, but can organic feed the world? And I put that in quotes because that is an idea that gets tossed around that itself needs quite a lot of unpacking. These are a number of reports, and there's others. These are consensus reports from experts around the world showing that, in fact, ecological farming is the only thing that is going to continue to feed human populations into the future. That industrial agriculture is undermining the natural resources that we need to continue to grow food. So pollinators, soil health, water conservation, climate change, etc. The one in the corner, agriculture at a crossroads, so many people don't know about this report, but it's very important. This is the IPCC of agriculture. So the way we look to the IPCC for the consensus, the scientific consensus on climate change. This report involved over 400 experts from nearly every country in the world, and the findings were business as usual is not an option. We need to rapidly shift to ecological approaches to agriculture. I circled that one, Farming for the Future. This is a report that Friends of the Earth put out a couple of years ago that summarizes and tries to debunk some of the myths around is pesticide intensive agriculture necessary to quote unquote feed the world, and that necessary shift to ecological farming. So how do we shift this system? It's deeply entrenched. There are powerful players that are working to continue it. They're working to continue business as usual, and yet we know that we can't continue on this path. So I think about change in terms of a three-legged stool, that we need market change, we need policy change, and then we need the science and the storytelling that really reaches people and inspires them to take action. I'm going to give you some snapshots. I've talked quite a bit about the science and some of the storytelling involving those families, so I'm going to talk more about market and policy change. Institutional purchasers, so hospitals and healthcare systems and schools, can be a really important part of shifting the food system. This is work that I used to do with Healthcare Without Harm. This is a picture from San Francisco General when they signed the Healthy Food and Healthcare Pledge, which hundreds of hospitals and health systems across the country have signed. And what this pledge says is we understand that the dominant industrial food system is a driver of public health concerns, of environmental damage, and we pledge to do what we can in our food service to support the shift to a healthy and sustainable food system. So this is a report about a set of Bay Area hospitals, San Francisco Bay Area hospitals that collaborated to make that shift. It reports on their purchasing of local and organic produce and how they made that happen, because really if any of you are working in hospitals or schools, you know that food service system is so oriented towards purchasing through an industrial industrial food channel. So it really is the amazing efforts of doctors and nurses and dietitians and food service directors who are going above and beyond to create this positive change. Some great work is happening in Michigan, and hopefully you can learn about that from folks at the Ecology Center. Here's work on schools that a colleague of mine at Friends of the Earth is doing, and they're working on shifting to climate-friendly plant-based options, which results in savings because really the meat and dairy on people's plates is often the most expensive food items. And so when you shift to plant-based options, you're getting sort of a triple win. You're reducing water usage, you are reducing carbon footprint, and you're getting cost savings. And so some of these schools are using that cost savings to purchase organic or to purchase more sustainably raised meat or dairy. And you can find more about that in these two reports: a recipe for combating climate change and scaling up healthy climate-friendly school food. And then some market work that we are doing with supermarkets. So obviously some of the most powerful players in our food system. We have been in dialogue with 10 of the largest supermarkets. Well, I shouldn't say supermarkets because some of them are pharmacies, like Rite Aid. Some of them are big box stores like Costco and Walmart. So the largest food retailers in the US, pushing them to increase their organic offerings and also to phase out use of toxic pesticides in their supply chains and to publicly disclose their progress. So in 2018, Costco was the first to take steps by releasing a pollinator health policy that encourages their produce suppliers to decrease use of neonicotinoids and chlorpyrifos. And since then, we have seen Kroger, Aldi, Albertsons, and Rite Aid also release pollinator health policies. This is great momentum, and at the same time, none of those policies have time commitments, time-bound commitments. And so we are really continuing this effort to push these companies to make some real commitments with teeth to reduce the use of these seriously toxic pesticides. In an effort to push them forward, here's some food testing data that we did at the top 4 food retailers in the US. You can see that that's Walmart, Kroger, Costco, and Albertsons Safeway. We tested their house brand products with partners in 15 states across the country. And I think that it was the Ecology Center that went shopping in Michigan. I'm pretty sure, so many thanks to you. And So sorry, I was not involved exactly with that piece of the outreach. So thank you to all of those organizations that sent us samples. We sent them to the lab, and this is what we found, is glyphosate residues in all of the oat cereal and dry bean samples. This is consistent with results that other organizations have found. This is also important because the USDA doesn't test for glyphosate residues in food, unlike nearly all other frequently used pesticides. So a lot of organizations have been doing some of that glyphosate food residue testing. The high levels in these foods in particular is because glyphosate is also being used right at the end of the season before farmers are harvesting to dry down the crops. So it's being used as a desiccant. And because that is right before harvest, it results in high levels of residue. So, you know, Environmental Working Group, you may have seen, they've got a great report called glyphosate. Oh shoot, what is it called? Something like a dose of glyphosate for breakfast, something like that. So you can Google that. We found neonics in applesauce and spinach samples, and organophosphates in apples, applesauce, and spinach. So this is the whole set of food that we tested, and these are foods that kids frequently eat. So trying to make that connection with the companies and saying, look, in some of your quote unquote healthiest foods, we're finding levels of pesticides. Shifting to some policy wins and ongoing policy efforts. CHLORPYRIFOS, I mentioned that the federal government walked back a planned ban. That was one of the first actions of the Trump administration. The previous administration, the EPA had determined CHLORPYRIFOS should be banned. So we're still fighting for that at the federal level, waiting probably for a friendlier administration to move that through. Since then, Hawaii, California, and New York have enacted bans. So that's particularly significant. California is such a massive agricultural state. So that will hopefully begin to shift practices and be the writing on the wall for other states. And I want to call out consumer use was banned since 2000 because the data is so clear that this pesticide is harmful to children's developing brains. We've got ongoing state work in a number of states. We've got the National Ban Toxic Pesticides Act in the House and the National Protect Children, Farmers, and Farm Workers from Nerve Agent Pesticides Act in the Senate. Glyphosate has been banned in 13 countries, including France, Germany, and Austria. It's restricted in 8 other countries and hundreds of locations worldwide. And you can look up that full list, which was developed by the law firm that has been arguing the court cases. And just to say for folks who have not heard about those court cases in the news, 3 have been tried, and these have been a school groundskeeper, farmer, and people who are using glyphosate. People use high levels of Roundup in their home lawn and garden care, who all have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that's the connection, glyphosate exposure and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that there's really strong data on. And all 3 of them won their lawsuits. There's 55,000 lawsuits that are pending against Bayer, which is the company that bought Monsanto, the originator of Roundup, and of all the Roundup ready genetically engineered crops. So tangent there, but on the federal front, there is a National Keep Food Safe from Glyphosate Act in the House. It's not got many co-sponsors, but it would take some really important steps just to test for food residues, to ban the use of glyphosate as a pre-harvest drying agent, and to restore the original food tolerance, the legal limit for glyphosate on food, which has been increased, I think 2 or 3 times by the EPA under pressure from Monsanto. Our level of legal food residues in the US is significantly higher, for example, than the legal limit in the EU. And then finally, neonics. They've been banned, as I said, for outdoor use in the EU. Consumer use has been banned in Maryland, Connecticut, and Vermont. And over 100 cities and universities have restricted it. And we've got ongoing state work as well as a couple national bills that, again, will require a lot more political will to move those bills through. So I want to close just invoking Rachel Carson, who said in Silent Spring, man is a part of nature and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. And evermore, we've got a growing body of evidence that reveals that the pesticides that we put out into the world come back. They are in our bodies and they are causing serious health problems. And another of my favorite quotes, we participate with our bodies in a metabolic process and can be eroded like the stones and trees. And I have found in my whole career that platform of working from the intersection of human health and environmental harm is such a powerful place to reach people, to educate people, and to look for change. Here are some great resources. That book, Whitewash, is a political thriller, I would call it, but it's really just a journalistic analysis of the story of glyphosate, of the uncovering of all of the deceptive practices of Monsanto and their efforts to keep this pesticide on the market, despite very early warning signs that it had carcinogenic potential, that it was concerning to human health. Now it's also been associated with hormone disruption, kidney toxicity, fatty liver disease, on and on. So something to pay attention to in the news. And that's what I've got for today. And if we've got a few minutes, I'd love to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendra. We have had some questions start to come in. As a reminder, please be sure to share your questions using the chat box. But Kendra, one of the first questions that we have here is asking about neonicotinoids and if other countries also use them, or is this primarily a United States issue?
Yeah, so the European Union was using them also at significant levels, but as a result of the data showing their harm to pollinators, they have banned all outdoor uses. They are the most widely used insecticides in the world. So yes, absolutely, they're being used globally. One of the largest uses in the US is as seed coatings. So something that people often don't hear much about. Sometimes farmers don't even know that they're planting seeds that have been coated with neonics. This is also not a use that's being tracked in our pesticide use data tracking. It's a massive loophole. And I've got multiple thoughts firing at once here, but they're used to coat seeds like a corn seed or a soybean seed. And yet the data that has come out, including data from USDA, shows that that's not resulting in yield benefits or economic benefits for farmers. So sadly, our primary use of this highly environmentally toxic class of pesticides is not even resulting in benefits for farmers. So this is really a class that Friends of the Earth and so many other organizations are working really hard on getting restrictions and ultimately getting banned.
Thank you. Another question that we had come in is if you could expand on what exactly dead zones are.
Yeah, sorry. So synthetic fertilizer, what that little image was the Gulf of Mexico. If you can imagine the Mississippi and the entire watershed of the Mississippi is largely an agricultural regions where large amounts of synthetic fertilizer are being used that washes off into streams and waterways into the Mississippi and then down into the Gulf of Mexico. The fertilizer ends up in massive algal blooms that then robs the water region of oxygen. So it becomes a dead zone where fish, where other organisms can no longer survive. So that's happening in hundreds of locations worldwide because this very chemical intensive industrial approach to agriculture has been exported worldwide.
All right, so another question that we had come in, I think it's a really good one to consider. So it can be hard to stay positive after learning about how much money agrochemical companies are putting into lobbying. How can we stay positive and continue this important work when these big companies are essentially controlling our food system?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I lately, and this is a result of that spinning food report, which drew some very good connections between the efforts of the pesticide companies and the tobacco companies. And, you know, thinking about the decades that it took to get real restrictions on use of tobacco products, and that we've had a massive cultural change and a decrease in smoking. So I look to tobacco for some hope to say that really we can regulate these massively powerful industries. It's a bit different because individuals choosing whether or not to smoke is different from farmers choosing whether or not to use pesticides, but I do think there's some analogy there. And then the other place I look for hope is really the growth of the organic sector. The fact that people are increasingly choosing organic, people don't want to eat residues of toxic pesticides. So that is within the food sector, the fastest growing segment. So I take hope there that we actually have a solution. This is not pie in the sky. This is a production system that works, that produces abundant food. And consider the fact that organic works, and we're not even devoting more than 1% of our federal research dollars to organic and ecological farming systems. So can you imagine if we shifted our federal agricultural research to organic and ecological farming, what we could do? And all our billions of dollars of federal subsidies are going to support pesticide intensive food systems. So again, if we could only shift 5–10% of those subsidies, even less, a greater percent, just imagine how rapidly we could scale up the solution that we already have.
Came through is asking about the USDA and if do they provide on-site technical assistance for farms to move towards organic farming?
So in the last Farm Bill, which if I think about my dates here, was decided in 2018. We did have some wins for the National Organic Program. The other benefit of organic is it's federally regulated. There's laws protecting, you know, what organic means. There are fines. There are processes to hold people accountable if they are falsely claiming that their products are organic. So some wins were an increase in the funding for the National Organic Program. And that allows the USDA then to increase their support in programs that can help farmers to shift. That said, I think that some of the strongest work supporting farmers to shift is happening with regional organizations, so state level organic organizations. And sometimes some really leading companies are doing that work of helping farmers through that transition to organic. Yeah, one other win that we did get in the Farm Bill was a certification cost share program. So that helps smaller farmers afford the organic certification. So there's a whole set of different policies that do support farmers to help make that shift. And by far not enough. So we're importing massive quantities of organic food because the US government does not do enough to support farmers to shift.
So kind of on another side of things, specifically around individuals and residents, do many cities try to educate residents about integrated pest management for their yards? Locally here in the city of Ann Arbor, a resolution was passed to do this back in February of this year.
That's fantastic. And I don't work on local policies at all, and so I just don't know. It's a wonderful question. And I'm trying to think of even anywhere on our website we would have that sort of information. I know that we've got toolkits for university students. We used to do some support of getting universities, students to push their universities to implement integrated pest management plans, but I'm not sure on the local front.
And I'll open that up real quick just to see if Melissa or Rebecca, if either of you have any knowledge of any other cities who have done similar work. But while you do that, we do have another question that just came in. Do many road commissions use herbicides along the roadside? Again, here in Ann Arbor last July, it was urged that the County Road Commission to reduce roadside herbicide spraying and adopt best management practices.
Yeah, great. So Roundup is one of the most frequently used herbicides on roadways and other, public parks, public everything, school grounds. That is a major problem. There was a bill introduced in the House this year around implementing integrated pest management plans on roadways. And the aim of which is, of course, decreasing the use of Roundup. And just to call out, Roundup has been associated with the massive decline in monarch populations because it's being used so ubiquitously across agricultural fields and on the sides of roadways. And it is killing the one plant that monarch young depend on. They only eat milkweed, and it is wiping out milkweed across that monarch migration route. So that bill that was introduced is a bill, is an effort to protect monarchs and other pollinators. So all of that work is so critical. And many thanks to any of you who are listening who are involved in that type of work.
Great. Oh, and so I just got a message in. Oh, go ahead, Becca.
Well, it may be similar to Melissa's. Do you want to read that? And I just saw that too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Melissa just chatted in that most local cities do not educate their residents about IPM or reduced pesticides usage.
That's right. There's two other things that I'll let folks know in terms of like yard pesticide usage, either by your neighbors or by used in a city. So Ecology Center has been leading some work to actually do environmentally preferable purchasing policies in both Michigan cities, and then actually we're coordinating a national work group on this as well. And we're really focused on toxic chemicals. And so that's one of the things that for those folks who are on the webinar that are part of our fellowship program, you'll learn more about that work. And Michigan also has a registry, so you can find out if your neighbors are spraying pesticides. And there's some efforts right now. Unfortunately, it's difficult to get on that registry unless you have a doctor's note. And so there have been bills that have been introduced in Lansing, and Melissa has worked on some of these. And there's increased effort, and we'll see if things open up in the legislature in a year or so to pass something like this through to get pesticide notification if your neighbors are going to be using pesticides on their lawns or in their yards. So if they have a chem lawn or something like that. So there's a couple of things, that isn't something that had any traction, well, it won't in this legislature, especially during COVID. But hopefully in the next couple of years, we could expand the pesticide registry in Michigan. And then also the work that's happening at the local level to get local municipalities to use less pesticides or not use any pesticides that are toxic. Yes, and
Oh, and
Melissa
it looks like,
reminds us
yep.
that the registry only applies to certified pesticide applicators. So that's going to be your ChemLawns and things like that, not your neighbor who just goes to the Home Depot and buys some pesticides. So that's important to consider too.
All right, so that concludes all of the questions that we currently have in the chat box. So I want to take just a moment again and thank Kendra so much for taking the time to present for us today. And as a reminder to all attendees, the webinar materials will be made available tomorrow. So just a couple quick housekeeping items before we conclude today. Oh, we already have a lot of thank yous coming through to the chat box. I'm showing appreciation for Kendra, which is always great.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm so glad that I could be here.
And so, just like I said, a couple quick things. First up, I am chatting out our webinar evaluation to all of you. The webinar evaluation is required for all current health leaders fellows. However, we would also strongly encourage all other participants to complete the survey as well. Your feedback is really valuable in planning future meetings and seeing what other type of events folks would be interested in participating in. And speaking of other events to be participating in, the next event in our Toxic Chemicals and Health series will focus on ending lead poisoning. We'll be joined by Elin Betanzo, founder of Safe Water Engineering LLC, a consulting firm working to improve access to safe drinking water through engineering and policy consulting, and Ecology Center's very own Deputy Director, Rebecca Munich. This webinar will cover sources of lead contamination, health impacts of lead poisoning, and what can be done to avoid lead exposure. And I am chatting out that registration link now as well. Gotten a couple questions if you will have access to the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, as long as you register for today's webinar, you will be receiving an email sometime tomorrow with the webinar materials. And with that, I'd just like to thank Kendra again and to all of you for joining us today. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.